So hello, everyone, and welcome to our event tonight. You may know me and recognize me if you've been to the Bruce Museum. My name is Kate Dzikiewicz, and I'm the Science Curatorial Associate here at the Bruce Museum and the Seaside Center Manager during the summer when the Seaside Center is open. I'm actually curating the next, one of the next upcoming exhibitions opening on June 12th of the Amazon rainforest, which is going to be art, science, photography. It'll make you feel hope, it'll make you feel sad, it'll make you learn things. So we look forward to having you back in person to the museum shortly, and I hope that you come see my exhibition when it opens. Now, just because we have people visiting from all over the world and it's online and we're not sure if some of our people have ever even set foot in the Bruce Museum, I'd like to introduce the museum as well. So the Bruce Museum is a museum of both art and science, and sometimes history, located in Greenwich, Connecticut. And this particular program is part of the Bruce Presents series, which brings together thought leaders in art and science for both fascinating discussions and lectures. And before we get started, I'd like to go ahead and thank our sponsors for tonight's event, Berkeley One and Northern Trust. We actually have a representative for Berkeley One here with us tonight, so I'd like to go ahead and pass the mic on over to Katya for a few words of support.
Great, thank you, Kate, and good evening, everyone. Berkeley One is proud to be a co-sponsor of the Bruce Presents, and as you can imagine, in the world of insurance, leaky pipes are a huge negative, and I was really kind of fixated on that title. But I think, in the world of STEM, the loss of women in the fields is a huge negative as well. I mean, where would scientific advancement be without Madame Curie, Ada Lovelace, Katalin Kariko, a name I just recently learned because of her amazing scientific research in science that has actually helped lead to the vaccines that hopefully we're currently getting. And of course, other more recent luminaries like Katherine Johnson and the rest of the hidden figures that kind of represent more of the hidden female figures of STEM. So really, but tonight we're really about looking forward and fixing those leaky pipelines. And we really look forward to hearing this incredibly talented panel discussion on not only their achievements, but their thoughts on how to stem those pipes going forward. Thank you.
So thank you once more to Berkeley One and Northern Trust. We couldn't make these events without your generous support. Now on to the main program. So just a few words about the format of this program. So this is a panel discussion. And the first part of the program will be us discussing amongst ourselves with prepared topics and with topics that are brought forth from the panelists themselves. But at the end of the event, we're going to open the floor up to questions from our audience members. So if you have a question throughout this session, I encourage you to please type it into either the chat box or to the Q&A box. So the Q&A box would really be the best, but if you can't find that, feel free to put it in the chat box, and then we'll try to get to all the questions at the end, depending on how much time we have. Now, welcome to Women in Contemporary Science, How to STEM the Leaky Pipeline. This is a topic that's really near and dear to my own heart, and I am incredibly excited that we have 7 amazing women with us here tonight, broadcasting from 3 different continents. So the pandemic has made some things more challenging, but it is incredibly exciting that we've managed to pull together these 7 amazing women from pretty much all over the world. And I'm going to let our various different panelists introduce themselves in their own words. So first, just going off first, whose window is on my screen, I'll pass it off to Dr. Jessica Ware.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Dr. Jessica Ware, and I am a curator of invertebrate zoology at the American Museum of Natural History. And as a curator there, I actually specialize in a particular group of insects. I mostly work on dragonflies and damselflies, termites, and cockroaches. And I've been really interested in doing pandemic talks like this because I love talking about dragonflies, and it's nice to be able to talk to people on 3 different continents in the evening about dragonflies. And I'm not coming to you from Manhattan. I'm actually coming to you from Cranberry, New Jersey, in central Jersey. So thank you for having me.
Okay, the next little box on my screen is Adania Flemming.
Hi, everybody. And again, thanks for having me as well. It's a pleasure to be here. I am from Trinidad and Tobago, which is in the Caribbean, Twin Island Nation, but I'm actually in Gainesville, Florida today, coming from there. and I am a PhD student in the Department of Biology at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. But I also have a joint appointment in the Florida Museum of Natural History, and I'm a research assistant with IDIC Bio. And I'm trained as an ichthyologist. I study fish, usually ecology, right now freshwater ecology. But my experiences as a Black female in ichthyology has led me to become really interested in folks who are in STEM, and that has led to the topic of science education and broadening representation in sciences using museums as a resource. So again, nice to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, next on my screen is Dr. Tara McAllister.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko waia hau, ko te atanga maha ki tōku iwi, ko Tara McAllister hau. So kia ora everyone. My name is Tara McAllister and my iwi or tribe is Te Aitanga Mahaki, and I am coming to you from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm on the traditional lands of Te Atiawa ki Whakarongotai, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Auckland, and I did my PhD in freshwater ecology, and I'm really interested in the experiences of Indigenous people in STEM. I'm really excited to be here today to contribute to this conversation. I'm also a mum. I have 2 sons, one is 3 and one is turning 1 next month. So yeah, that's me. Hi.
Okay, Dr. Catherine Early, if you could please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Really looking forward to our conversation tonight. I'm Catherine. I am the Curator of Ornithology and Chair of the Biology Department at the Science Museum of Minnesota. So I'm joining you from St. Paul, Minnesota. At the Science Museum, in that role as part of the Science, Equity, and Education Division, I oversee our biology collections and also work with our education and equity staff to make the museum and our collections more accessible through educational programming.
Okay, and Rochelle Saunders.
Hi, I'm Rochelle Saunders. I am originally from Canada, but I'm living in the UK, so it is just after midnight here. I've got some coffee to keep me company. I am a self-taught programmer and working programmer and technical product manager, helping build an educational tool that teaches young people the technical skills of cybersecurity to try and fix that leaky pipeline, which is leaky for many reasons. But I'm also a podcaster. I am one of the hosts and the producer of the long-running podcast Science for the People, where we do long format interviews with, quite frankly, a lot of people like the people on this panel, with researchers, journalists, writers, all kinds of different people about science topics, quite often intersectionally science topics, science and culture, science and history, science and politics, all that kind of good stuff. And that podcast has been running in one form or another since 2009.
Okay, next on my list is Dr. Jennifer Rosati, who you might know if you've been to some of our previous science lectures. She's been a speaker at the Bruce before, so we're very happy to have her back again for a second time.
I'm excited to be back as well, so thank you for the invitation. My name's Dr. Jennifer Rosati. I'm an assistant professor at John Jay College in New York. My research interest is in forensic entomology, so I study the insects that are there during the decomposition process. So it's definitely not a field for everybody, to say the least. I'm also the major coordinator for our forensic science program, and I also coordinate the first year biology courses at the college as well. I'm usually in New York, but with my family, we're in Canada at the moment during the pandemic, since labs are closed down and the college is closed down. So usually in New York, but here from Canada and here with my insects in my rearing room. So looking forward to the conversation tonight. Thank you.
All right, and last but not least, we have Dr. Tarika Barrett.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Tarika Barrett. I'm the incoming CEO of Girls Who Code. We are an international nonprofit committed to closing the gender gap in tech and changing the image of what a computer programmer looks like and does. Half of the girls we serve are Black, Latinx, low income. I am calling in from Gowanus, Brooklyn, and I have 2 kids, ages 12 and 14.
All right, so I think that we can go ahead and get our conversation started on the leaky pipeline. So just a definition real fast. So the concept of the leaky pipeline is that as you go up and up and up in levels in academia, you tend to get fewer and fewer women in science. So one of the numbers the statistics I was looking at was that in the United States, over half of all undergraduates studying biology are women, but there's about 50-50 female to male grad students. But then when you start to look at hired positions, there's fewer and fewer women. And when you get into tenure track professors, there's maybe 10% women and 90% men. And it's even fewer when you reach into those high ranking leadership positions. So even though we have women who are clearly interested in science, for some reason, these women are not able to make it into this higher ranks of academia. So we call that the leaky pipeline, that these women are falling out of the scientific pipeline for whatever reason. And I actually want to get this conversation started by talking about the personal experiences of our panelists. So clearly we all now we're working with sciences in some manner. In some cases, we have some of our panelists still in graduate school. So we have a variety of different perspectives. So what would you say really helped keep you in the pipeline? And was it a fairly straight track? Have you been interested in sciences all your life? Or were you, say, studying French poetry in undergraduate and only went into sciences once you'd graduated? So let's talk about our own pipeline experiences, and feel free to just jump in.
If nobody minds. For me, I think I always excelled in the science and math areas. So for me, I was always interested in science. I was passionate about it. It kind of came a little bit easier to me than say maybe the dramatic arts and English and philosophy and other courses like that. So from grade school, I kind of recognized that for myself. And then in high school and then in university, it just kind of followed suit that I was selecting courses that were in science and math. As far as knowing what I wanted to do and getting to where I am right now, that definitely was not a straight track. For entomology, I was actually terrified of insects as a child. It wasn't until I was educated about them and learned about them that I realized that I was actually interested in them. But I think having the science and math gave me the background that I needed to be able to kind of dive into that subject area. So it's kind of a mix of both and figuring out kind of what you enjoy and what you're passionate about to kind of lay the framework for what you want to do for the rest of your life. And then I had a lot of support as well. So support from my family, support from my friends, a really good network of support that allowed me to obtain my education. So I think that is a good key to being kind of figuring out what you want to do and then taking it to the next level.
Yeah, I think for me, I always had a really strong affinity to water growing up. I was always in the beach, in the water, if it was the middle of winter or, the height of summer. I think my path has been relatively straightforward so far as an early career researcher, but I would say I've kind of been an accidental researcher. So I started my undergrad at university and I had no idea what a PhD was, but somehow eventually found myself completing a PhD. I think being a mum has motivated me to stay, I guess, within the pipeline. My ancestors have given me a lot of strength, and my family and my community all provide inspiration to kind of keep me within STEM. And I think as a young person in STEM, it was really apparent to me that there were no, I didn't really have any Māori role models in STEM. So it's really important for me to stay in so that I can be that role model for other people. And I think thinking about the pipeline, in here in New Zealand, a group of Indigenous scholars have kind of critiqued the idea of a pipeline because it kind of insinuates that we passively fall out at different stages. But really the reality is often we're pushed out. It's not a passive thing because of the structures within STEM, I guess. So we like to think of it as using a Pacific navigation metaphor, that we're navigating on our waka, on our canoe to different islands, and there are storms that stop us along the way, storms that are racism, storms that are sexism. So yeah, I just thought I'd mention that as a provocation for other speakers to kind of think about the idea of the pipeline.
I can jump in here because I think that's like the perfect provocation, although I can see other folks nodding and wanting to jump in too. I mean, you know, when I think about our work at Girls Who Code, we know that it's not just about a leaky pipeline. We've taught over 300,000 girls computer science. And, you know, there was this recent TechCrunch article that came out that really tried to dispel this myth. You know, it's much deeper than just that. And so I think it's the racism that you're pointing to, all of these other factors. Our girls, even though we, you know, teach them to code and they fall in love with STEM and computer science, they continue to encounter these systemic barriers when they've quote unquote made it. So it's not just about, you know, STEM education. It's more, you know, we teach our girls coding, but we also teach them to thrive and lead in the industry, but it's the cultures that they're encountering when they get there. And certainly it's true of the academic space as much as it is the tech industry. So, you know, I can definitely relate to that. And, you know, thinking about my own journey, I love hearing everyone's, you know, backgrounds and profiles and the insects. Wait till I tell my kids, one will be horrified and one will be enthused that, you know, anyone is even thinking about touching a roach. You know, for me, it's been a journey as, frankly, you know, an education equity advocate. So my PhD is in teaching and learning. And, you know, one of the things that completely changed what I did was when I actually worked as a teacher and then had a chance later to work at the New York City Department of Education. And it was during that time that I had the chance to lead the team that designed and launched New York City's first ever high school focused on software engineering. And it was deep equity work to actually think about us designing a school where Black and brown kids would have a seat at the table, because very often these schools were screen schools. It's also the moment where, you know, I knew that our education system was just not set up to close a gender gap in tech. Fast forward, and I think so much of that equity work defines, you know, the work I'm doing now as CEO of Girls Who Code. And so while, you know, I can't say that I am, you know, working with birds or insects at this time, I think our work to get every girl energized and to get them to fall in love with STEM and with tech, and frankly, to see themselves as technologists, is the work that I think is really powerful. So I couldn't agree with you more, Tara, in terms of this is really much more complex than just a pipeline problem.
I would love to continue from that because I feel like you guys just laid a foundation, especially as a PhD student here. So you heard lots of doctors. It's sort of overwhelming to be here because of like, should I be here? I haven't got my PhD yet. Am I really a scientist? And I had this question along my journey. And so kind of going off of some things said before, I'd like to share like my journey to where I'm at right now and sort of the notion of why I think that metaphor you used, Tara, is just so perfect. So to start with, like I said in my introduction, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. So I grew up on an island, and most people might think, oh, I've had the questions in undergrad, oh, your grass skirts and growing up on these things. And I'm like, no, that wasn't my experience growing up. It wasn't until actually equivalent to the US or folks that are in different places, secondary school, where I got chosen to go to a camp, and I realized that my island was like amazing. There's like all this biodiversity and all this stuff, and I'm like, I didn't have the opportunity to do that because we didn't have a car growing up, and the beach wasn't like in our backyard. And so experiencing that camp that was called Jedi's, we didn't get lifesavers, but we literally were charged with understanding our environment and being stewards of our environment, thinking about sustainability. And that's where I started to really envision my career past what was kind of prescribed for me in the natural sciences. And that led me to I loved water at the time, so kind of resonate with Tara's idea. Like, I just loved aquatic systems. Like, what's in the water? Like, there's so much stuff. And when you get in there, and that was kind of what I was excited about. So my undergrad was in marine science, and I left home because I wanted to try something different. Came to the US for undergrad. And when I finished undergrad, I was like, what do I do next? And I knew I wanted more, but I didn't know what that more would look like. And trying to figure it out was really challenging because as a marine scientist, there's all these different fields that you can go into, and I wasn't sure which one. So to me, it was like asking questions of folks who had been in that spot before. And one of the things that was really challenging was there were people that looked like me to ask the questions to. It's like, okay, is that space for me? And that was one of the biggest questions I had, was, do I belong here? And in undergrad, I was able to surround myself by folks who also were from the Caribbean islands. And so I found my community, and that literally has been what has sustained me throughout my time in science. And in places where I can't find community, I literally build community. And that's sort of how my science research right now has stemmed from my love for aquatic systems and fishes and ichthyology and inverts to now looking at advocacy in science, so really thinking about the scholar activist aspect. And so I've created a course to actually help students do science in a meaningful way, other than that passive, like, here's science, I'm that person that knows it, I'm going to tell it to you, then you'll do it and you move on. Because like Dr. Tarika spoke about, like, essentially you get the knowledge, but then you don't feel like you have the competence to move past that. So that's been the place I've been sitting with. And I will say in my communities that I have right now, and a lot of those are folks that look like me, and a lot of it some of it formed over the last year because of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. And I am so happy that I shouldn't say I'm so happy, because it's not a great thing, but COVID allowed us to stop and pause and see what's happening and really take notice of some of the things that we kind of avoid. And so some of the things named before in academia, that just white supremacy and how academia is steeped in that. And so we're a product of the policies and procedures that are meant to, like, literally oppress folks who are trying to move past it. So that's kind of a lot, but essentially my journey has not been linear. It's been trying to figure out, and experiences have led the way to the next steps, and building community along that space has been that path to get me through the imposter syndrome of, like, do I belong here? And the last thing I like to end with, based on what Dr. Barrett said, was in terms of, like, I've been invited to so many tables, and I've realized how much I've been tokenized because of being the one of in many spaces I've occupied. And so I've had the notion now of, like, instead of occupying the seat at the table that I'm invited to because nobody else can be there, and when I try to include other people, it's like, oh no, this is just for you because you're that token. I've started looking at ways to build my own spaces. Instead of joining your table and when you're ready, I have to get up and leave, I'm like, how do I build a space where we can invite others in and not have that, like, okay, it's your turn, you don't agree with this, move on. And that's basically where my science and my research intersect with science education. So I'm looking forward to chatting more.
I'm going to jump off that because I think that leads really well into some of my thoughts. When you talk about creating a space rather than waiting for someone to invite you to their space, I feel like that is as much as we can at the core of our volunteer-run podcast. We're all volunteers. Nobody gets paid to run our show. And we're all the hosts are female. That's really important to us, even though it's not anything we post anywhere. It's like an unspoken rule. At least one voice in every episode will be female, even if it's the host. We're all from science, tech, and just curious lay people backgrounds. And we pretty much, to a person, we do our very best to always ask women and people of color first wherever we can, because you can always find a white man to get on your podcast. It takes you 15 seconds. You can always find a white man. So our sort of policy is to try and find a not white man first. And that for us is a really important part of what we do, and trying to talk about topics in a way that we don't hear about in a lot of other places, tackling them from a lot of different angles that I think comes from our backgrounds as women, and as people who have come at science and the science that we do or the tech that we do from very different journeys. And we like to think of things in a wider way. I think from a personal journey, I have made it through the pipeline without leaking out or getting pushed out, which I think is an apt metaphor, by sheer force of personality and stubbornness. And I'm sure many people on the panel would share that. And I know in tech, at least, one of the things that I found really frustrating at the beginning was I would ask someone a question and they'd like take my keyboard away and start to do it for me. And because I'm very obnoxious, I would just say, look, don't tell me, don't show me how to do it. Don't do it for me. Just tell me what to search for. Like, give me a term. I'll figure it out. All I need is for you to just like boost me in the right direction so I don't spend 3 days down some rabbit hole that doesn't make any sense. So I spent a lot of time training men how to not get in my way, if that makes sense. And I found some great allies in that process, but I did have to train most of them, which is not really what we want at all. You want people to be able to support you and help you and encourage people without necessarily having to be trained by someone who is, you know, a little bit obnoxious and has a healthy ego, because not everyone does. I spent some time in my day job working with young people and teaching them the technical skills of cybersecurity. And I've had the pleasure to go to some in-person events with a mixture of students, and some of the quietest, shyest, most nervous kids, and a lot of them are girls, are just some of the girls that will blow you away once they actually get going and they feel secure when they get into something. And it's really upsetting to me that I might be the only personality that can make it through tech. That's really unfortunate because tech needs a wider variety of personalities, not just people with big egos who are willing to ask lots of questions and sort of take things and grab things. It needs all kinds. And I think that's true of science in general.
I will jump off that and then say that I've had those exact same conversations with my friends who are women in academia about how academia also selects for certain personality types, and not the personality types that make academia a friendly place for people who are not cis hetero white men. So my background is I always wanted to work with animals growing up. I thought I was going to be a vet because I think that's what you always think. You're going to be either a vet or zookeeper if you want to work with animals. And I think I internalized that vets made more money than zookeepers, so that's what I was going to be. And I also was lucky to have role models like Jane Goodall. Like, she was a big figure in my childhood, someone to look up to, and I was able to see myself in. I was also lucky to be able to volunteer at a natural history museum that I lived close to growing up. But even with that, you know, I'm a curator now, but I think at the time I didn't know what curators were because I was volunteering with their live animals. So I was taking them out on outreach, introducing people to the different animals that we had, helping them get over fear, the things like snakes and bugs. And then went to undergrad, still thinking about vet school, realized in like the first year of coursework that that was not what I wanted to do. And then I got lucky again because the university I went to offered a dinosaur class that was at the time taught by the Bruce's very own Dr. Daniel Sepka. And that introduced me to paleontology, and actually working in Dr. Sepka's lab as an undergrad led me down the path where I ended up doing a Ph.D. at Ohio University and doing a postdoc at the University of Florida, and then ending up as a curator. And I think that path kind of demonstrates, you coming off of Tara's metaphor, that for me, there were not a lot of storms. And I think a lot of that has to do with my race and my privilege. And so when we think about this pipeline or this system that forces people out, it's going to affect different people differently. You know, I knew I wanted to work with animals, but I didn't know how I was going to get there or how I was like where I wanted to end up really. But because I had a supportive family and a lot of other forms of privilege, I still ended up making it. Whereas people with other backgrounds with less privilege maybe have to know like exactly what they want to do and exactly how they're going to get there to end up making it to what they wanted to be.
I could maybe jump off of that and say, when I was growing up in Canada, I really didn't know any scientists. And so I thought maybe I would go and do something at university, but I really didn't know what. And if I hadn't gone to UBC in Vancouver, there was a couple of people who were TAs for my classes who actually explained that there was such a thing as work study, that I didn't have to work a midnight shift at a gas station to pay my bills. I could do work study, I could get research opportunities. That was really unknown to me. But then even with their support and their help, I was the only Black student in the program. And then when I went to graduate school, I was the only Black student in graduate school. And I actually was the first Black person to get a PhD at Rutgers in entomology. And that was in 2008. So still like a lot of firsts that are kind of left to happen. When I got a job, I was the only Black person in my department. And now at the AMNH, I'm the only Black female curator. There's also an astrophysicist who's there, who's kind of a curator slash a personality. So you're, kind of constantly feeling like you're the only one can be a bit overwhelming. But I think that the reason why I almost left several times wasn't because of the isolation. It was actually from pushing. So I had people many times say, you shouldn't be here. You should drop out. This is not the spot for you. And I think that if I didn't have like a circle of people that I could kind of bounce things off of, and I'm lucky because I have a twin. So I was able to, and my twin and I are pretty in sync. So I was able to kind of text my twin, this doesn't seem right. I think this doesn't seem right. Do you agree that this doesn't seem right? So I could kind of check and make sure, because some of it is gaslighting. Some of it is designed to make you think that you're not actually being pushed out, but you are. But like the system is set up to make it seem like it's just actually happenstance, that you just kind of happen to feel like you're not, like you shouldn't be here, and so then you kind of tiptoe out when actually you're kind of being pushed. So it's nice to be able to kind of have people who you could bounce and double check to make sure that you don't feel like you're interpreting it incorrectly. And so a big part of what I've done in my professional life is to try and build communities and build kind of networks of visibility, so that people could have that very checks and balances, so you could check in with people. So we created the Entomologists of Color, in part for recruitment purposes, to diversify the field of entomology, but also to create this community, because we're all humans living in society, and society is broken. Right? There's so much systemic transphobia, homophobia, sexism, and what have you, racism. And so, people bring that with them to work. It's not like they leave that at home. And so kind of creating this network so people can kind of talk about it and work and process the things that are happening day to day is, I think, really important for keeping people in the business.
I'm realizing with dismay that we've somehow already made it over halfway through, but there's so many powerful different conversations happening here. And actually something that Adania said really stuck with me, that she said that the pandemic has really given some time for things like the Black Lives Matter movement to flourish. And some of this, the impacts of the pandemic are going to be positive like this. People are reaching out to each other across the world, being able to connect with people that they might not otherwise have. But unfortunately, a lot of the effects of the pandemic are devastating, especially for women. I've read things that suggest that we might be seeing basically the loss of practically an entire generation of women who've had to drop out of the workforce, to childcare obligations as schools shut down due to COVID. And I wanted to kind of get some of your opinions on that. Is this something that you've seen personally? Is this something that's affected you? And a lot of you are very closely entwined with education. So are you seeing students that are suffering due to the pandemic? Or do you have other different positive things that have happened, do you think, because of the strangeness of this last year or so? How has the pandemic influenced you or the work you do?
Yeah, I mean, I can start and just say, like, COVID has just laid bare all of these inequities. They've amplified the things that we already know to be true. And, we find that our girls and young women, and especially our girls and young women of color, have been disproportionately impacted. And it's hard, right? We know those numbers are staggering. I think it's like 2 million women who have left the workforce since the pandemic, which you can't even wrap your brain around. And we were seeing this exodus in tech pre-COVID. We did a study with Accenture where we saw that 50% of women leave the tech industry before the age of 35. And that compares to 20% in other roles. And so when COVID hit Girls Who Code, for us, we had to really, especially given our population, we had to say, where do our girls and young women find themselves in this moment? And how do we sort of step into that gap? And when we think about it, even just our summer programming, we surveyed our girls. We asked them whether they were caregivers. We asked them if they had hotspots, Wi-Fi. What did they need to be, synchronous and asynchronous? Like even something as straightforward as how much time they have to give to programming really mattered for us. And similarly, with our young women in college, we asked them where they were, and we learned that 30% of them had lost internships, and that 40% of seniors were still looking for jobs. So those, again, there are so many more real-time data points that we could look at, but we know that I would say COVID has not been kind, right? We know that 12 million students don't have access to the internet, and if I can point to anything that is positive, it might be that there's some equity barriers, like things like access to APCS, that you can't just say because your school doesn't offer AP computer science that you can't take it. So there are ways in which I think teachers have been kind of pulled into blended learning and the use of technology that's very heartening. But just because the technology exists, it doesn't mean that our students have equal access or fluency. And we know that it's our most marginalized students who have not had a really good transition to remote learning. I see my own kids struggling. They're allegedly in class, but somehow are watching a YouTube video. They luckily have access, but they're completely disengaged. And, I could go on and on about just patterns we've seen around engagement and things we've done, but just being mindful of patterns of participation and how quickly this time is going. I'll pause and let others jump.
I could say that as a mentor to graduate students and postdocs, I definitely have noticed that the people who I work with in my research group who have younger children are really struggling, and the people who even the people who don't have young children or who don't have children at all are still doing an awful lot of work. And I get the impression that there's some type of uneven kind of work distribution in the home that kind of is an extra burden. I'm a single parent, so I was we already had a routine where I just yelled at the kids a lot to get them to do stuff. So that already was set up. But I think that if you didn't have that routine, then it just seemed like my female graduate students, all of the burden to homeschooling was dumped on them somehow. And as an advisor, as a mentor, the part of what I've tried to do in the last year was to set up all of the other scaffolding around them so that they didn't have to, so they could just work when they could. But it's a real challenge, I would say.
Yeah, I can follow up with that. I'm one of those struggling women in the workforce. I have 2 young ones at home. I'm trying to do live sessions for my students, and I can tell you at times it's nearly impossible. The children are always screaming in the background. They're distracting. I don't know how many nights I spend up all night trying to catch up on work, and that's just because it's the only quiet time that there is. And I'm going up for tenure this year as well. So I'm trying not to get forced out of the pipeline, but having the kids at home during this pandemic has made it impossible at times and extremely difficult. And I see my students struggling with this as well. John Jay College is a minority serving institution. And so many of my students have these challenges where they are becoming the sole support financially for their family, and they're trying to get their education at the same time. And unfortunately, their education ends up going to the back burner. They have small children that are living in their family unit as well. Financially, they're being hit, emotionally and physically being hit by COVID, taking out their, spreading throughout their entire family, and still trying to do their schoolwork. And so, I think just it's a struggle for a lot of people and a struggle for a lot of students. And I'm seeing students that are dropping out of their courses, that are failing out of their courses, that are not engaged. And also a lot of our students have accessibility issues. They simply don't have the internet. They don't have Wi-Fi. They don't have laptops. They don't have high-speed internet that's enough for them to participate in their classes. We have a lot of programs at John Jay College. I'm actually proud to be a part of John Jay College for the support that we offer to our students. And we're very good at kind of recognizing those inequities, addressing them, and trying to support students as much as we can. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. and hopefully, we can get back to normal. And I think that we've been able to recognize a lot of these accessibility issues as well. And so hopefully we can take this information and going forward, and we can actually implement these strategies when we do get back in person to, help ensure that all the students kind of have the same platform to work from.
I think one of the things that I've been most struck by during the pandemic is how it's just like an intensity up of the standard cultural problems we have in academia and tech, and probably some other fields as well, being unfriendly spaces to take breaks. This is particularly true for women who tend to be caregivers in their families, whether it's caring for small children, caring for teenagers who sometimes need care, but also caring for elder people. Our mothers, our fathers, we tend to disproportionately be the caregivers in our extended families. And academia and tech for sure are two career paths that are very unfriendly to taking breaks. You cannot easily take off 9 months, 6 months, 3 months even, and be able to jump back in. There's a ramp up process, and people see you as behind just because you weren't there. Those fields, they move really fast. And if you can't keep up with them, it's difficult to it's so difficult to keep up with them sometimes that the concept of not being there on a day-to-day basis for 3 months and then having to try and catch up is daunting, I think, to most people at the best of times. And it feels to me like coronavirus is just everybody experiencing what women tend to experience, in particular with things around maternity leave generally, and for a much longer period of time.
So that actually leads into something else that I've been thinking about and wanting to talk about. So sort of looking at solutions. So I know that we see a lot in the news of horrifying instances of racism and sexism happening. And then of course they say, oh, the workplace, they're going through training, they're going through diversity training, they're going through implicit bias training. But personally, I know that at least at the museum, when we get trainings, it tends to be kind of one and done and not necessarily a huge impact. Of course, these are mostly, computer safety trainings. And I think that we've had a couple online, sexual harassment trainings and things like that. But what it makes me think is that if you don't put the emotional effort into these trainings at the workplace, then it's so easy for them to just go in one ear and out through the other. So I was wondering if I could get some of your thoughts on, so what are the ways to address these issues in our current workplaces? We can't, unfortunately, we can't build these places from the ground up in every situation. So what is the best way to combat this sexism, this racism, homophobia, transphobia, all of the inequities we see in the workplace? What can we do? Is there a training that you've seen that have worked really well? Is there a change that you've seen that has somehow managed to make a big difference in your workplace? What do you think? How can we move to a better place?
I can speak to this as someone who's just recently joined a workplace. So when I joined the Science Museum over the COVID summer, which is an odd time to start a new job. And it, like, as I mentioned in my intro, I am part of the Science, Equity, and Education division. So our research and collections are housed within a division that focuses on science, equity, and education. And there's been an institutional commitment to dealing with these issues of white supremacy and racism and centering equity. And we don't always do a perfect job. It's an ongoing effort. But being at an institution where that's even talked about, coming from academia where, it's sometimes talked about, but maybe focused on in the sociology department, which is all the way across campus, being in this smaller institution that has made a commitment to equity has made a huge difference for me. So we don't really have trainings. I would say we have like museum-wide conversations that everyone is invited to participate in. I think there's like a museum book club where they pick a book that has to deals with these issues of equity in science, and everyone reads it and comes together and discusses, everyone who wants to participate, because obviously there's no point in forcing someone to participate if they're not going to do it in good faith. So to me, like being somewhere that has made that cultural shift or is trying to make that cultural shift has made way more of a difference than being at an institution where they respond when things happen, and maybe do a training when things happen, but then the white supremacy is so ingrained in the culture, at least in America, that if you're at an institution that's part of that culture, it's really hard to change it with little band-aids like trainings.
I can offer a couple tangible resources if these are helpful to folks. And I think it's so complex, right? When you talk about institutional racism and what's already been hardwired in. And I think that very often any of these anti-bias trainings are one-off things, and they have to sit in a culture, or at least an attempt at a culture reset that's far more systemic and far-reaching. But I'll point to a couple of resources that come to mind. One is this amazing organization called Elevating Equity, and it's led by Rachel Willis. And she is this phenomenal educator that, she basically talks openly and honestly about race. And we know that we really can't talk about equity in education until we can have those kinds of conversations. And at Girls Who Code, we've worked with her now for several years, and it has been a series of multiple engagements with our staff, and somewhat trusting that we're going to advance that work in her absence too. And the other organization that I'll point to is called the Management Center. And folks may have used them before, but they're really focusing on, creating sort of supporting managers in being equitable in their practice, and also thinking about how to make organizations themselves efficacious by thinking about, putting equity in a central spot. And so it's like, how do you interact with people? How do you think about bias? All these different things. So I think those are just two resources that come to mind. But again, I think because we at Girls Who Code are obsessed with transforming the tech industry, we recognize it's a cultural reset there, where it's about hiring practices and hiring more people who look like me at the most senior levels. It means that, when our girls and young women get a foot in the door, what are they encountering? Are there pathways to be promoted? Do you have mentorship? Are there employee resource groups? And are we not seeing situations where we're only counting on people of color and women in tech groups to advance all of the agenda? Because that's what often happens at these companies, where it's just a small group that's supposed to carry like all the heavy load around these issues, when that's not what's going to move us forward. I mentioned there was a dog in the picture. I'm going to mute myself now.
I 100% agree. I think that any amount of training is never going to solve any of these problems. I think it's a lot to do with getting people in the jobs and making people feel less alone when they're standing there. I am so often the only woman in the room, and every once in a while I walk into a tech room that is mostly women, or even like 40% women, and I'm just like, oh yeah, this is nice. And every like brief little moment I walk into a room of 100% women and like one lone guy in the back, and I'm like, yeah, this is nice. I wish this could be every day. And I think that's the biggest thing. I think it has to really change in hiring first, because it's just lip service. It's just nice seminars where people get together and say, yes, for sure, let's be less racist, let's be less sexist. But until you actually get the diversity in the space, it's kind of meaningless from my perspective.
So that actually reminds me of a quote from Ijeoma Oluo. She wrote a couple of books, but the one that it's coming from is So You Want to Talk About Racism? And in one of the short lines she said is, people want to feel better, but they don't want to do better. So they want to talk. Let's talk and talk and talk and talk about doing something. But the actual doing part is the part that usually is lacking. And the part of doing is usually lacking because at least in academia, it revolves around changing policies. And changing policies means you have to have people to be adamantly speaking up about what needs to happen. So first, like we do with science, realize, okay, what was done before? What is the history that brought us here? And how do we adjust for that? And how do we move forward? And so people don't want to look back, because then they're like, oh, I'm not racist. And it's that binary of like, I'm a good person, I'm a bad person. And we get stuck there, and we don't know how to move past it for racism. And I'm speaking there because that's the space I deal with a lot as a Black female. And so kind of what was spoken about before, I think it's really what needed is the hiring practices, but parallel to that is also cultivating a space where people can come in when they're hired and not feel like, why am I here? Because people are leaving right now as well as we're trying to get people in the door. So you have this flux of how do we get people in? And the policy changes, there's lots of conversations, but how the folks need to have them. And I think Dr. Barrett, you said this really well, is not us, not the folks who are already marginalized. It needs to be the folks who are the majority that have to push for it, because we need like allies and co-conspirators in this work. And I would share one of the resources that have been really helpful to me is Academics for Black Lives. They ran a series of different trainings, and it'll probably come again. I'll put the link in the chat. And for me, BWEAMS, Black Women in Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Science, I met them last summer. And to find in those spaces, kind of like Dr. Saunders said, is seeing Black females, and we're writing, have an accountability group, and we're seeing them there. And knowing that, okay, we're going through this together, and validating experiences is important. So I think part of like helping solve or move forward is finding spaces where you're comfortable and really thinking about those policies, and whether it's tech or science or whatnot, like the policies were created by whom and for what reason? And so why do we keep them if they're continuously oppressing folks along different axes? So the policies.
I think like white men have to be willing to give something up. In order for the status quo to change, they have to be willing to give. Some people have to get up from the table and make a space, but a lot of people don't want to have the status quo change. That's why they just want to talk, because to actually do the something means that they may not get the spot that they otherwise would have earned just by the right of their birthright. So I think that's the challenge is there needs to be consequences, I would argue, for bad behavior that goes beyond mandatory training, like consequences that goes to tenure files and tenure decisions in academia or what have you. And who gets grants and things like that and awards. But then we also need to like cultivate this idea among our white peers that not everybody, if things are going to change, you can't all be the ones that are the governing board. You can't all be the ones that are holding all the spots, because then actually nothing changes.
So it's hard to believe, but we've been talking for almost an hour already. So I have so many other questions that I personally would love to ask you, but we actually have a variety of questions in our Q&A. Let me open up the chat as well. Oh yeah, so yeah, people are mentioning that they think that there are studies that changing the names on resumes and CVs and stuff like that from the names of women or people of color to names typically associated with white male men get them hired more often. Yeah, I've seen these too. So do you think our hiring practices, do we need to go to blind hiring, or is targeted hiring the way to go? But, on the other hand, targeted hiring can lead to severe backlash. So how do we fix our hiring practices without completely, well, maybe we do need to completely restructure academia.
Maybe it's somewhat of a conversation about our obsession as, a society around notions of meritocracy, or that somehow someone should have the seat at the table because they've achieved certain things. We see really interesting things. Even, we have an amazing base of corporate partners who support the work that we do. And it is with the best of intentions at times that they're thinking about who they want to offer internships to, or who they want to offer job opportunities to. And all of us, have this experience, right? How do you get selected? It's because of some evidence of leadership, it's some evidence of GPA, it's all these different things. But we are kind of all convinced that those are the right metrics, that that's how we should be thinking about these things. And they don't fully account for privilege and the ways in which, folks have had very different journeys and pathways and support systems along the way. And it's hard to dismantle that, because these are the bedrocks of sort of how companies determine who is qualified or not qualified. And so it really takes a dismantling. And I think we are fortunate that we have had, a series of movements that have caused folks who typically would not be thinking about this to kind of be a bit more reflective about diversity and inclusion practices. And I think for the first time, I've heard people say out loud, okay, we're coming to terms with the fact that we're very comfortable hiring for entry level, but we actually don't want to replace my senior role with someone who is Black or brown, because I don't know if we're seeing qualified candidates. So conversations aren't pretty, but we're having them. And I think they're exactly the, not so comfortable conversations that need to happen. But yeah, I'm curious what other folks on the panel think. I think it's a very daunting task, but a lot of it's also getting the folks who make decisions in the room. Very often, these are very idiosyncratic and nebulous black boxes of things that you don't understand around hiring practice. And we've been at this for a minute and haven't always had line of sight to how these decisions get made. And I think that's true for candidates too.
I think we really need to kind of change the way that we not only hire, but also promote people within the academy. And so one thing that I often think about, which has been alluded to, is who is in the room when decisions around hiring are made. Because, if the room is full of essentially white men, then they're gonna probably hire someone that looks similar to them and does, similar work to them. So can we be a bit more reflective about who is making those decisions? And perhaps that's linked to who are the senior leadership in our universities and in these institutions. Do we need a leadership change so that that change comes from the top down, as well as in different kind of areas? And I've just completely lost my train of thought. So I'm going to hand it over to someone else.
Yes, we actually have someone else bringing up a sort of similar question. So Claire Adams says, in academia, a lot of the attitudes and cultures is set from the top. So how can we put pressure on these people to convince them, who are often white men, that our concerns as women of color are valid? So I think that that's one of the major problems facing institutions and academia in general, that we get these people at the top of institutions who are usually white men, and then they stay there for 20 years. So how can we push these institutions into the correct path when it's so hard to change that very, very pinnacle?
One thing that we're doing here in New Zealand is kind of getting as much data as we can of Indigenous academics, which proves that we're underpaid, we're underpromoted, and actually publishing that data is quite an important step, because they can't really hide from peer-reviewed research which shows that yes, you are racist. So that's been one of the things that I've found is quite important. And I think going back to the previous point, I think targeted hires are really important, but also cluster hires, so that when you come in, you're not the sole Indigenous or Black person in a department of predominantly white people. So I think the idea of hiring a bunch of people at the same time kind of provides a layer of cultural safety that's really needed when you're entering these sometimes really hostile environments.
So I would add to that, because I always hear, can you all hear me? Sorry. Okay, yeah, I always hear like the board of directors. So they always pitch it forward. Like it's not me, it's the person above me. But what we've been doing here at the University of Florida, we have something called the UF Black Effort. And that's a collective movement with undergrads, grads, faculty, staff, and alumni. And so really part of it is building community, but part of it is holding the university accountable and looking at kind of that data gathering, like here's the data. And here you're seeing this person, you're seeing that person. So it's kind of like we just keep passing the buck. So how about you do your part in every wrong? If the person below the top says something or does something, then we can actually create a change, a kind of ripple effect, but a targeted, intentional manner, because everybody wants to say, it's not me, it's not my job, because you want to sit comfortably in your position. But if you just get a little bit uncomfortable and do the work and become part of that change, like become part of that activism that's needed, then we can actually do something versus saying, oh no, it's not me, it's higher up. So why are you there? You're blocking your gateway to be able to move past you. And as part of that has been looking at different bylaws, because different departments have those. And again, back to policies, who's writing these policies? When were they written? Who were they written for? And are we thinking about the changes and the privileges that come with being able to be in the place to write these and continuously edit and send them off to be like, this is the law. Why is this the law? Are we creating this law and saying we have to stand by it, but why? And so it kind of goes back to something said before of, we need to reevaluate what we value. Like, what do we value? Like, what is important? And what are we looking towards? Like, what does the future hold? And are we moving towards that? Or are we moving towards staying where we're at and being comfortable in the seat that we're sitting in because it's comfy? And I think that's a big part of it.
I think for me, as a white woman in tech, it's trying to understand when I should use what power I have and when I should cede what power I have, which can be a tricky balance. And I definitely don't always get it right. And I will continue to joyfully get it wrong and hopefully be told when I get it wrong. But it's very easy to not take the power that you are offered and try and do good with it. And so in those places where I am in the room, and I do sometimes find myself there, I do what I can to try and lift people who are less privileged than I am and to point out where those things are. I think doing the podcast and doing a lot of reading on a lot of these intersections and complexities has helped me understand where I sit a little bit. And because I'm also a type of person who's known to ask a lot of questions, and that's kind of my personality, I think I'm able to prompt some of those discussions in a way that is somehow less threatening. And maybe it's like the spoonful of sugar with the medicine sometimes. So it's trying to understand and trying to figure out when is the right time to wield what power you have and when is the right time to step back and let somebody else take it. And that's can sometimes be a hard thing to do.
So I'm fighting glitchy internet, but I see actually some other interesting questions and comments. So Julia Dzikiewicz says, do you have any favorite female scientists or coders that inspire you? And I'd like to expand that to say, have you seen any organizations or people that you think are really getting it right? So let's get some shout out, some positivity, even if it's your own organization that you're proud of and really happy about the successes you've had. So
I love Girls Who Code. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. I so appreciate that. And I will shout out other organizations like CS for All, doing amazing things to advance computer science for all kids across New York City. And frankly, they're a national organization now too. And organizations like All Star Code, where they're focusing on Black and Brown boys, Black Girls Code. I mean, there are just so many organizations really thinking about that. And, you know, we opened up, I can't remember who talked about Hidden Figures, but obviously, you know, Katherine Johnson, although, you know, there's so many women who frankly our girls and women need to know about so that because we always say at Girls Who Code, you cannot be what you cannot see. And, you know, when I look at even just this panel, what it would mean for girls and women just to see this conversation, they don't always know what's happening and they're not certainly always, you know, invited to have a seat at the table. So just so many sources of inspiration that we could continue to shout out, I think.
I'll say that a lot of the people on this panel, I was so excited to be on this panel because of the lineup. And a lot of your work I'm familiar with because I follow you on Twitter. And so in that line, there is a Twitter group called Black AF in STEM. They do fantastic work. They started the Black Birders Week on Twitter. And that introduced me to a lot of Black birders, including one of my favorites, Karina Newsom, who also was a zookeeper. So like ties into my love of animals and her enthusiasm for the natural world and animals, and especially birds, is just amazing. So if you are on Twitter, I recommend checking out Black AF and STEM and their members. And you can, if you can find like the hashtags that Black Birders Week use, that's a good way to find inspiring posts too.
Well, since there's 3 Canadians on the call, I would give a shout out to Marianne Andretti, who started the Canadian Black Scientists Network. And I am fortunate, even though I'm a Canadian that lives in the States, I was still invited to join and come to their meetings. And if I had experienced that as a young person growing up in Canada, I think I would have made different decisions and things maybe would have been a lot easier. So a big shout out to her for doing the work to build community.
So I would add Vanguard STEM. I sort of found them sort of on the outside of it, but they do a lot of really good content for Black and different people of color in STEM along different axes. And I mentioned BREAM already, Black Women in Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Science, and then Academics for Black Lives. So there's a lot of, I'm like losing thought in terms of folks, but there's a lot of folks doing things out there. Twitter has been a popular place for finding folks.
And actually,
sorry, just a quick one. In terms of people doing really great science communication and tech communication, Rose Eveleth and her podcast, Fast Forward, is really excellent. She gets a lot of women, a lot of people of color on her show. Her diversity is excellent. Her topics are excellent. She's a futurist, but not a terrible futurist. Her and her guests imagine a lot of really interesting futures, and they blend tech, science, and creativity and storytelling together in really interesting ways. So just give her a big shout out too. She's one of my favorites.
Yeah, so we have one, we have requests for these various different people being typed into the chat box so we can, so our viewers can find more people to follow on Twitter. And here's another one that I really love. So our Gillian writes that Adania mentioned, what does the future hold? So what does success look like for each of you specifically? So none of you have said in X years, I will be at the top of the pipeline or I will own the pipeline. So if in your lifetime, what would you like to see kind of the great successes, either personally for you or kind of impact on the field? Are you hoping that you're out there inspiring people every day, or do you just want to be head of a museum?
I love that question. At Girls Who Code, our goal is to close the gender gap in entry-level tech jobs by 2030. We have over 80,000 college-aged alums and workforce-age alums. And so for us, it's about, activating that interest, expanding that pipeline, but also getting more women to actually enter the field and stay there. So that's where we are at Girls Who Code.
I think my kind of overall goal for the future is, I guess in Māori culture, we have this thing where you have an obligation to the next generation coming along to either leave things in the same position or a better position. So I want to use my privilege as an Indigenous woman in academia in STEM to ensure that it's a little bit easier for the next generation of Indigenous women coming through. So as part of that, I take my kind of responsibility to critique universities and the structures and the storms which continue to try and push us out of the pipeline. My obligation to do that is really strong.
I think at the end of that question, the asker mentioned that they thought this conversation would be very different, with the definition of success if there were men on the panel. And so my definition of success would be for that to not be the case. I would love for men to care about these things just as much as women do. I would love for white people to care about these things just as much as people of color do. So yeah, that's personally, I'm actually very happy where I am. So I'm good. I get to do help with equity work and education work. I get to do science. I get to protect and conserve museum collections, which I'm really passionate about. But as a field, like that's the definition of success, is everyone buying into this work and not just certain groups of people doing it. But yes, I agree, the way it is right now, if you asked a group of men in STEM what their definition of success would be, I don't think there would be as many conversations about lifting up other people.
I would echo that. And I kind of mentioned that, so you preface that I mentioned what does the future look like, and it's because it's something I think about a lot, and I think about it because of my mentees, and kind of like Dr. McAllister said, a lot of what I do is because I wish it was done for me, and I have that notion of like paying it forward, and my biggest dream is to see that this struggle, this oppression, this like not fitting in and just feeling like, why am I here? And I'm getting a little emotional, isn't a day-to-day aspect. And so I think a lot about, I'm doing research, trying to develop my dissertation, but I have to deal with all of this. And I think about my peers who are like, oh, today was easy and life was nice. And I'm like, I wish I could say that, right? And so my biggest hope is that that would be what the future looks like, that it's equitable and not equal, because equality is not what we're looking for equitability, because we're a long way from actually having equality. So equitable situations is what I'm hoping for. And in terms of my near future, I'm essentially creating my own field, my own position is what I'm working on right now, because it doesn't exist. And I hope that others would do that too, because some of the positions we have right now didn't exist before. And I think dream building is important along your part. And that's sort of what I'm doing. And I hope that others will find that space and be able to do that as well.
I can answer. As far as, success and what success kind of means to me in my position, hopefully it's maintaining a position in academia, but part of my job role is taking on some more administrative duties and acting as a mentor for undergraduate students, for females in science. And so success for me is, every time I walk into a classroom, it's about inspiring someone to do what they want to do, go after their goals where they may have lost confidence in themselves. And that kind of keeps me going in academia when I have any down moments, is, I reflect on some of those emails that I get from students that actually say that I've made a difference. And so for success for me is taking that, and if I have more administrative roles, I can actually make more of a positive change by listening to my colleagues, by listening to students, my peers, people that are experiencing hardships that I might not have, experienced myself due to my own upbringing. But listening to those experiences and recognizing them as valid and taking them into account and trying to make changes to make it a better environment for students, people of color, for women in science. Just to me, that would be success, is leaving something better than what I had to go through or what others need to go through, that I've made some sort of improvement, whether it's in my field, whether it's in my job, and whether it's with my own children. It's kind of what I would deem as success.
Yeah, so hearing everyone saying that, they're really hoping to impart an easier time to the next generation is actually really punching me in the heart, because I was almost booted out of the pipeline by a female mentor who would treat me and my cohorts poorly and then say, this is how it's like in the real world for a woman in science. They're not going to be nice to you in the real world. Like, I'm preparing you because this is what happened to me. And when I compare that very kind of toxic, vicious, abusive attitude with this kind of positivity and this kind of growth mindset that I see from the people here, I think that I think that your students are going to be incredibly lucky. I think that already that we're seeing a kind of a regime change between the kind of toxic, well, I got punched, so I'm going to punch you attitude from the older generations to the no one lifted me up, so let me lift up you of the future generations.
I think one of the things that I learned is, after having spent a long time working in the field, it made me harder And it took me a long time to realize that that was an impact on me and not actually who I was. It's very easy to internalize that as like, no, that's just who I am. And one of the things I am also trying to do, in addition to lifting up who I can, is also imparting some of that softness onto the culture around me, male, female, white, Black, whoever's there. If I'm seeing that toxicity of the like working 80-hour weeks, hero coder, constantly on, no life outside of work, I try and just push that against that, to be like, don't do this. It's bad for you. It's bad for us. Like, it's bad for literally everybody, but it's this terrible toxic culture we have that I know, hearing from you people, hearing from my partner, talking to so many academics through the podcast is just a real problem. And it's in tech as well. It's just, I think, a problem with work culture generally. And I'm trying, as I've learned, to try and impart that on other people, to do what I can in some small way to push the culture away from all those hard edges and constant commitment and that kind of really toxic work culture we have.
So I'm going to try to wrap this event up by around 8:30. So I think that we have maybe one final question to kind of close out the conversation. So I see a Cirrus Ware, which may be a relation to Dr. Ware or not, saying, how do we make sure that those are the most marginalized make it through the pipeline? But I want to expand that to saying, so each of us here is watching as an individual, hopefully because we have, you know, a strong interest in being part of the solution for this. So what can individual people, the ones sitting at home watching this, do to help? Say maybe they're parents and they want to help their kids, help their girls go through school better. Or maybe they're thinking of their coworkers or their institutions, or maybe they're thinking about their town and how to be a voice for positivity. So what can people take home and do to really start helping this change on their own?
I mean, I would say, you know, ask a girl a question in terms of whether or not she's ever thought about STEM, coding, you know, it's computer science. It could just be the sciences writ large. Very often I find that we forget that we don't actually ask our girls these questions. We make, you know, tremendous assumptions, and very often our boys have been asked this question like 10, like I don't even know, countless times by the time they have to make a choice, and our girls haven't had that question. I think it's about fostering a love of the sciences and technology in our girls, exposure. I talked about like role models and mentorship, you know, at Girls Who Code. It's what's great. It's not just about Girls Who Code. There's so many resources out there for girls to get involved in technology. There are books, even, I think we even have a board book, like, you know, teaching like coding like through a sandcastle. I forget, it's like a baby book. And then, you know, my daughter was obsessed with our fiction series when it came out. And if you look at the cover, there are all these girls represented. And she said, you know, Mom, look, there's a brown girl on the cover. And, you know, this is real, you know, for our girls. And in this case, this was my daughter who saw herself reflected back. So much of it is about engagement. Parents, you know, engage your daughters. I think it's also, it could be, you know, a niece, a cousin, whoever. And, you know, if you want to take it one step further, think about leading a Girls Who Code club. You know, go onto our website. We have free resources called Code at Home. You can literally learn alongside a girl at any moment with any of the resources we have. So that would be my one ask.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Catherine. I was just going to say that, I mean, we have a lot of opportunity to invite people to do different things, whether it's something for the PTO at your school, whether it's a seminar series at your work, whether it's panelists for events, whether it's people that you want to collaborate with. And Cyrus, it's actually my twin who asked this question, you know, Cyrus and I have talked about this a lot. You know, how many Black trans women do we see represented in academia? How many Black trans women do we see invited to participate? It's actually very small numbers. And my colleagues might say, oh, that's just because there aren't any people that are interested in entomology. But that's of course not the case. It's that we need to do a better job at inviting people, inviting them to everything, inviting them to all the different things that we do, not just, as maybe Adania was alluding to, just occasionally when it's okay. You can be at the table for 10 minutes and then you've got to go. So I think we should do a better job at, whether it's, like I said, a PTO event in your town, a town council event, to something at your scientific society. Really think about who's getting invitations, because invitations are free. Usually, I mean, sometimes they're not free because you have to pay for their flight, but invitations are, the spirit of the invitation is free.
Following on that, I think a lot of times I hear that same argument that, like, oh, we don't have enough people, colleagues in this particular group to invite them, or we don't know any. I think expanding your definition of what a colleague is, and remembering that grad students are your colleagues, because the graduate student population is a lot more diverse and probably has a lot more of those intersectional identities represented. So invite them to participate, because it's good for them, it's good for you, because you can hear their perspectives. And the other things I was going to share is that, as we've talked about, a lot of this work falls on, in terms of women, like men, and especially white men, but also white women can do a lot to kind of pay forward the privilege and benefit that they've had from their race. And so a couple things that I've picked up from listening to organizers: one, being willing, if you're a white person, to sit in messy and uncomfortable relationships with other white people to talk about these things, not just, making it's hard to talk about, so avoiding it, or not just cutting out people. Cut them out if they're not good for you, obviously, but not just, taking the easy way out. And another option is divesting of white wealth or privileged wealth. If you have money, you can give to these organizations that promote people of color and women in STEM. So those are my couple of tips, that tangible things that people with more privilege can do to help.
There's a note in the chat: financial support often helps non-traditional women and grad students. Absolutely. Making financial support, even small bits, available to people who may not have the means to get to your thing in the same way that a lot of the same people we see on those things. Another big one that people often forget is childcare. Making panel events, making interviews, all that kind of stuff, if not child friendly, then okay with children. There's a podcast I listen to, not science-based, where when one of the female academic hosts was on it, she had her young son with her, and hearing it wasn't edited out. Every once in a while there was a baby gurgling. It's not that interruptive, it's adorable, it didn't cause a problem. Like, normalizing children in these spaces as okay. Spaces don't have to be 100% adult only. And there's been some great places where I've seen people just provide some childcare so that someone can go up and be on the panel for an hour and a half and know that their child is taken care of. And those kinds of small things that often aren't about just an invite, it's making sure that that invite is something someone can say yes to. Try as hard as you can to make an invite appealing and doable by a wide variety of people, and don't make assumptions on what that person's life situation is, what their time availability is.
Just building off the childcare idea, I think that one of the really tangible things that organizations could do to support parents in STEM is to have some sort of grants for childcare. Like last night when I was thinking about it, I calculated that it costs me $17,000 a year to send my 2 kids to daycare for 3 days a week for a year. And I'm not sure what the costs are like over in America and Canada, but I think they're pretty high as well. So that's a really tangible thing that we could help, would help kind of remove some of these inequities. And I think, Catherine, when you're talking about like bringing grad students into the community, like I think we could broaden that out as well to bringing the entire community into our institutions. And one thing that I often reflect about is how Indigenous knowledge isn't really valued in these institutions. And so that's something that I think could change. Like, why can't we have an elder come and teach us about science, because their science is 100% valid and has grown from a really close relationship with the environment over decades, you know. So maybe it's changing the definition of science so that Indigenous knowledge is seen to be equal, if not better, potentially, than kind of Western science.
Well, unfortunately, it's the time, it's 8:30, and I don't want to keep our panelists up too late or out too early. I could easily talk with this amazing group of women for another week. And in fact, there's so many things that I've heard today that have really changed my perspective. And I've actually been sitting here taking notes. So I am going to take some of these concepts and really try to apply them, at least to my own sphere of the museum, and bump out maybe a little bit into other people's spheres with some of these concepts to get the ball rolling. So I just want to thank everyone so much for attending. Thank, of course, to our wonderful, amazing panelists for giving their input, giving their emotional input, and really sharing these personal experiences with all of us, and kind of opening our eyes to some of the things going on and some of the things that we can do. So I'm afraid this concludes the end of our program. I encourage everyone to look up some of these women on Twitter, on Facebook, look up their websites, look up their organizations to give them support, and maybe even continue some of these conversations offline. But for now, I'm afraid we have to depart, but feel free to look at brucemuseum.org if you want to check out some of our other future Bruce Presents programs coming up. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great night, day, or whatever time it is where you are. Night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good